We're looking at 34 traps in the Sicilian for both white and black. You can use the chapters on the right side of your screen to navigate through them easily if you're only interested in a certain opening, or if you only want to see traps for one color. I would like you to firstly let me know what you think. Secondly, add the traps I didn't show in the comments below. Just give me the PGN or give me an idea of which variation the trap is in. I plan to make part 2 once I've collected more. Let's start. We're starting with traps in the Sveshnikov. So after knight f3, knight c6, we have d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, and e5. This is the Sveshnikov. If you don't know the variations I'm talking about, you can watch my videos on them. And if you need a PGN for the traps, you can find a link to it in the description below. So white's most common move is knight db5. And black responds with d6. You have to guard the d6 square. Bishop g5 is again the most common move. And in this position, a6 is by far the most promising. Now, white can play knight a3, or white can actually take on f6. Knight a3 are the main lines. After knight a3, b5, chasing away the knights. In this position, white can play knight d5, or white can play bishop takes f6. Okay, so our first trap is this very, very common move, which has been played a lot of times in the Lichess database, only 17 times in Grandmaster play, but that's still a lot. Black has to take with the g-pawn. If black takes with the queen, the position is completely losing. And the way white wins is knight d5. The threat is to take the queen and to fork the king and rook, so the only move really is queen d8 that defends against both threats. And now bishop takes b5. And after, well, if you don't take, then you're just a pawn down, you're about to lose even more material. When you take, the other knight comes into play. And now there are two knights looking at c7, and black is losing and about to lose material. If you play something like bishop e6, then knight bc7 is game over. The king is forced to d7, and now knight takes a8. Or if you try queen a5, trying to win the knight, that doesn't work. White can simply block with c3, and if queen b5, there's knight c7 winning, and that's game over. One more move we have to look at, if in this position rook to b8 is played, trying to double attack the knight, then b4 traps the queen, and of course a8 and c6 are both covered by the knights. A4 is covered by the queen, A3 is covered by the knight, B6, C7 are covered by the knight, and if the queen goes to D8, that doesn't really help. We go knight B to C7, and the queen basically has to take, because if king here, then this is going to be a mating to, after F5, queen takes F5. So that was the first trap. So remember that in this position, you have to take with the G-pawn. Before we have a look at the next trap, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Chessbook. Chessbook is a great tool for working on your repertoire. It makes studying and practicing your repertoire very, very easy. It's easy to navigate, it's easy to use, even for me. And if you guys know anything about me, you'll know that I'm not well versed in online culture and anything related to computers. So what's Chessbook? Well, it allows you to import your repertoire, work on it, but by practicing moves, reviewing your online games and the mistakes you actually made while playing, and it also allows you to go through some model games in your opening. So how does it work? Well, you can import your repertoire by hand or by importing a PGN file, which is how I did it for my black repertoire. Now, for white, let's say I want to import it by hand. Let's say start building your repertoire. Okay, since we did the Sicilian traps, let's do a Sicilian trap, the one we just looked at. So e4, c5, knight f3, will we look at knight c6, here takes, and let's get into the Sveshnikov. Okay, they go e5, we go knight to b5, d6 is the only move, bishop g5 is the only move, a6. This is the trap we just looked at. I just want to show you how it works. And now bishop takes f6, and we know that gf6 is the only move. If queen takes f6, then there's knight d5. Okay, I can save the moves to my repertoire, or I can keep adding moves. Let's say keep adding moves. Queen d8, and now we give up the bishop. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes. And we know what happens if queen a5 check. We know that we can go c3. The knight cannot be taken because of knight c7. And so on and so on. You can keep adding as many moves as you'd like. So when I go save these moves to my repertoire, I can actually practice these moves. And let's say practice these moves. Let's see if we remember everything. Knight f3, d4, okay, knight c3, knight b5. What did we do here? Bishop g5, knight a3, and bishop f6. And if they do that, we go knight d5, bishop takes, and knight takes. And you do that until you get everything right. Okay, I did everything correctly because I just did it and I remembered it. So you get to practice your repertoire, you get to work on it in a very easy way. You can also look at some model games. So you can see a model game in your opening. Let's see, this, my repertoire is black is the Sicilian now. Okay, and then you get to guess the Grandmaster's moves. I'm not going to do that now because it's going to be too time consuming, but it's a great feature and you get a game per day. And one thing I would like to highlight again, you can connect your online accounts, Lichess or chess.com or both, and it's going to find mistakes in your games based on the repertoire you've imported. Now, as you can see, I have 440 moves due for review, due for practice, and I'm going to do that later today. Follow the link to Chessbook in the description below. Let me know what you think, and thank you very much. Another Sveshnikov trap. Let's get into the Sveshnikov again. Knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes, knight takes, again, e5. This is the Kalashnikov, but the Sveshnikov could come if knight f6, knight c3 is played before e5. We're going to transpose most likely. Knight b5, d6, knight to c3, knight f6. We are now in the Sveshnikov, but again, we started with the Kalashnikov. And again, bishop g5. And in this position, as we saw previously, a6 should be played. After a6, knight a3, and we continue the game in the main lines. However, there is a blunder black could play that ends the game straight away. And I call this the h6 Sveshnikov trap because I've seen it many times. Now, I've been playing the Sveshnikov with white and black. So when I played white online, I faced this move a lot. And this loses the game immediately. White simply takes on f6. Now, if you take with the queen, then knight c7 is game over, you lose the rook. And in this case, if you take with the g-pawn, then there's knight d5. And again, there's pressure on c7. You really don't have any decent way to defend. If you play something like bishop e6, then of course knight c7. If you play rook to b8, trying to save your rook, that's even worse. Knight bc7. The king is forced to d7, and now this is going to be checkmate. Queen g4, f5, queen f5. So remember this, I've actually won probably more than 20 online games in this line. This is just a very, very common blunder. The next trap in the Sveshnikov, again, so knight f3, knight c6, d4, cd, knight d, knight f6, knight c3, e5. We are in the Sveshnikov. White plays knight to b5. Again, I should say that there are alternatives, but they are bad. Knight f3, knight f5, and knight b3. I'm not covering in any of these. Those are just bad moves. So knight to b5. Again, d6, knight d5. And this is the line Magnus Carlsen faced in the World Championship against Caruana. The idea is that after knight d5, ed5, again, black probably has to take because of c7. There is knight b8, looking to play knight d7, c5, and so on. Or there's knight e7. This is a very common move. And in this position, c4 is the most common move. Now, black can lose the game in a single move. And again, this is something I've faced a lot online. I should say that black needs to play the move knight to g6. And after knight g6, White plays queen a4, but now bishop d7 is a defense because the d6 pawn is covered by the bishop on f8. However, if black plays a6, the game is over immediately. Again, probably more than 10 games went my way because of this blunder. White goes queen a4 and black is forced to resign. There is no defense. You cannot take the knight, although that is the best move. What else do you do? If you play bishop d7, then knight takes is checkmate, so that doesn't work. If you take the knight, then queen takes rook, and there are no other defenses. There is nothing else you can do. If, let me come up with something. If queen to d7, then knight d6, again, the king has to go to d8 because the queen is pinned, and now queen a5 check. Queen c7 is the only move, and now knight f7. So it's all completely losing. This and the previous trap, you need to remember, this is extremely common. Most players, most weaker players, when they see a piece in the middle of their position, they try to chase it away. In this case, it loses immediately. An Alapin checkmate. Now, this is an easy one, but it still happens a lot, and I would like you to remember it. So let's go c3 in the Alapin. This one starts with knight f6, e5, knight d5, and bishop c4. Now, knight b6 is more common than what I'm about to show you. We're going to be looking at the move knight f4, which isn't losing in itself, but it's not a good idea. After knight b6, bishop b3, c4, bishop c2 is the line. But let's have a look at knight f4. If knight f4, white has this tricky move, queen f3, and this sets up a nasty trap. Firstly, it defends g2, it puts pressure on the knight. There are no good ways to defend the knight. If something like g5, that's just absurd because of d4. Black needs to play the move knight e6, of course. And if black doesn't play the move knight e6, if they go knight g6, then it's checkmate on f7. And believe it or not, I did win one game like this. I actually was working on this variation with a student of mine. We were looking at knight f4. And when we played a few games, he played this. And that's why I'm showing you this, this blunder. It's not that common on higher levels, of course, but it's a good trick to know. So remember, if they go knight f4, you go queen to f3. And knight e6, even though it's fine for black, black doesn't get checkmated, still puts black in trouble. There's an interesting move here, queen e4, which prepares knight f3 and d4. Okay. The next Alapin trap is also a simple one, but this is such a common trick in the Alapin that you just have to know it. Now, after c3, this opens up the queen. So this indirectly defends our e4 pawn in the event of the d pawn moving, and many people will play d6 or d5. So we go d4, expanding in the center, they go knight f6. And this position has been played many times. Black should go knight c6, blocking this diagonal. But many people, after dc5, don't play knight c6, they take the pawn on e4. And of course, knight takes e4, loses to queen a4 check. Remember this, if you play the Alapin or if you play against the Alapin, which is everybody who plays the Sicilian, don't lose your knights like this. I've seen this too many times. Very similar to the previous one, we can do the same thing to the knight in the delayed Alapin. So if knight f3, d6 against c3, knight f6, pretty similar. Let's say h3, which is the main move. Now in this position, black again should go knight c6. And after knight c6, something like bishop d3 should be played because now the pawn is hanging. But if they take the pawn straight away, same thing, queen a4 check, and that picks up the knight. The next one is a bit more complex. Again, we are in the Alapin or in the delayed Alapin. So after knight f3, d6, and this could transpose from a normal Alapin as well. c3. Now knight f6 is way more common, but knight c6 is how we get to this one. d4, bishop g4. And this isn't a good way for black to play, but I've seen many beginners do this. Of course, instead of bishop g4, knight f6 is better. And now white sets up a trap. White plays d5. And most people are going to go knight e5. So in this position, knight b8 is the best move. The idea is that black at least tries to get the knight back to d7 and then exploit the e5 square later on with the b5 expansion. White is much better because black had already made a couple of mistakes. But, you know, now knight a5, of course, should not be mentioned. b4 loses the knight. If bishop takes f3, then we just go queen f3. Again, the knight is hanging, so knight e5, we go queen e2, and we're going to go f4, and the knight is going to be in trouble. White has too much space and a very good position. But what I want to show you is knight e5 straight away, which is the most logical move. And now it seems like we have to play something passive like bishop e2, because we lose our queen if we take, but we can actually take. Knight takes, and if bishop takes, you can see that the black queen has no way to cover the checks other than queen d7. So after bishop b5 check, black is forced to give the queen away, and white is going to end up a bunch of material up after queen d7. Bishop takes, king takes, sorry, king d8, not king takes, knight f7. And after king takes, then simply king takes d1, and we're going to pick up the rook in the corner, and it's going to be game over. White is going to be a whole rook up. Even if the knight gets trapped, white is up a pawn and an exchange. So remember this. I mean, not many people are going to go bishop g4 here on a higher level, but on lower levels, that is very common. Let's start with the Smith-Morra traps. So after d4, one move I would like to look at first is something I faced the only time I played the Smith-Morra online, and they played d5. I was really confused, didn't know what to do, and I ended up losing the game. But okay, it's not an optimal move, but it's decent. It's similar to the Alapin counter gambit, sort of. So the best move here is dc. But let's say knight c3, which is also okay. D takes e4, knight takes e4, and knight d7. Now, if you play the Caro-Kann, or if you play white against the Caro-Kann, you're going to know this trick. This comes from the Karpov Caro-Kann. The situation is fairly similar. There's a pawn on c6 instead of c5, and white plays queen e2. Now, the reason black plays knight d7 in the Karpov Caro-Kann and in this position is to be able to play knight gf6 without having doubled f-pawns. In this position, of course, the best move is either knight df6 or e6, because this hangs mate in 1. Now, I'm going to be honest, when I played the Karpov for the first time over the board in a blitz game against the Croatian FIDE master Lovro Čupić, I lost to this trick. I did play knight gf6 in the Karpov Caro-Kann, and I vividly remember him saying, "I don't believe you lost to this." Yeah, well, since then I learned. Okay. The next Smith-Morra trap. Again, let's get into this. We're going to go into the main line Smith-Morra positions now. So c3, dc3, knight c3. This is the beginning of the line. And here black has several moves, knight c6, e6, d6, even a6 is playable. d6 in this line. And of course, white has a couple of options, knight f3 or bishop c4. We're going bishop c4 because this sets up attacks on f7. Okay, so black should play something reasonable like e6 or knight c6 or knight f6. If black makes a mistake with pawn to g6, this is basically game over, because we now go e5. And black's best move is knight c6. And after knight f3, we have a ton of pressure on the black position. We can go queen b3 and start putting pressure over here. After queen b3, e6. And black has so many weaknesses that all endgames are going to be much, much better for white. For example, after e takes d6, knight f6 and castles. And if queen takes at any point, then simply knight b5. And you can see that all of white's pieces are working together. But that's not what I wanted to show you. The main trap is if e5, this pawn cannot be taken. And again, this is a trap you're going to be seeing a lot in the Smith-Morra. If you go bishop c4 and they went d6, d5 loses in a single move. Bishop f7 wins the queen. The king is forced to take the bishop. So this is a very, very common maneuver, very, very common trap when the queens are opposing each other and black's king is still on e8. So remember this one. The next one in the Smith-Morra, again, let's get into the main lines. CD, c3 takes, knight takes, knight c6, which is more promising than d6. White goes knight f3, and now again, black has many options. The best move, in my opinion, is e6. d6 is also playable. g6, what starts this variation, is also fine. But again, we're going to go bishop c4. And now black has very limited options. Bishop g7 is the best move. You can go d6, but bishop g7 is best. If black plays knight a5, this is the losing blunder, and this is a move I would like to show you. So there are two ways to play this. I prefer the move queen d4, which is the engine-approved way to play. This attacks the rook, defends the bishop, and basically f6 is forced. If knight f6, then e5, and the knight has to move back somewhere, or knight c6 has to be played. Let's say knight c6, queen f4, and now if d5, which is the best engine move, then we take on f6. Okay, and if not d5, if the knight moves away somewhere, let's say here, then checkmate. So this, I think, is a great way to play. However, there's another way to do this, and the trap I would like to show you is actually bishop f7. This is equal according to the engine, but after king takes, we again go queen d4, and black only has one decent move here. That's knight f6. But most people, when they see this position, are going to see that the rook is attacked and that it's attacked by the queen. So they are going to go bishop g7, attacking the queen, defending the rook. This loses immediately. We go knight g5 check. The king only has the f8 square, and now we go knight e6 check. The queen is trapped. The queen is attacked. I'm sorry. The king is in check. If well, if king to e8, then, you know, just queen g7. And we're going to pick up the rook. If the knight is taken, then of course we just pick up the queen. Queen takes d8 check. So this, if they go knight a5, I would advise you to take. Now, if they go knight f6 after queen d4, black's position is fine, but still, the king is misplaced. If you want to be precise, though, queen d4 is better than bishop takes f7. Moving on to traps in the dragon, accelerated dragon, hyper dragon, dragon-like positions. Basically every position where black plays d6 and g6 in the Sicilian. The first one is a knight problem, which I would say is the most common way for white to win in the dragon against weaker players. So let's get into it. Knight f3, d6, d4 takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. Okay, now white has options, but bishop e3 is by far the most popular one. And black has options. Black should go bishop g7, but black can play a6, going into a sort of Dragendorf or Dragon Najdorf position. One blunder I would like to show you is actually something I faced before, and that's the move knight g4. Knight g4 is, of course, a very bad move because it doesn't control d7 anymore, and now white wins immediately. Bishop to b5 check. And the reason I'm showing you this move order is because this is a trap we're going to be seeing, and this pattern we're going to be seeing a lot. Now, the point of this check is that if knight c6, then we just take and take the rook in the corner. So, game over. But that's the only way to block. If queen d7, then you lose the queen, but white actually doesn't have to take the queen straight away. White can just go queen takes g4 because the queen is pinned. And the same goes for bishop d7 or knight d7. The bishop is pinned, so queen takes g4. I started with knight g4 for no reason at all by black, because it's a move I've faced and I won a game like this. But now we're going to be seeing the pattern in more common positions. Next one in the dragon is a way to enter, or for black to try and enter the dragon from the Fischer-Sozin, which is bad. Okay, so knight f3, knight c6, d4. There are other move orders, of course. Knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop c4. This is the Fischer-Sozin attack in the classical Sicilian. And of course, in this position, e6 is the best move. If they play g6, this is a very, very famous trick or a trap. You take, they have to take back, and now you go e5. And now the c-pawn is over here, so we don't have bishop b5 check threats, but we have something else. If, first of all, if d5, then bishop f7. We've seen this trick before. We've seen it in the Smith-Morra. This can also happen in dragon-like positions and in many other positions. If knight to d7, then we take on d6 and castle, and of course we have a much better position. This king is stuck in the center. We have excellent bishops. We're going to go rook e1. We have queen e2, queen g4, and so on. The d6 pawn could be hanging. Black is, I would say, completely busted here. This is extremely hard to play. If they go knight h5, this is also a bit more complicated than the main move trap I'm about to show you, but it's easily refutable. You go queen f3. The idea behind queen f3, of course, is that you put pressure over here and you put pressure on f7. So when they go e6, you could take, this is +4, you could take here and still be much better, but after bishop d7, your queen has to move again. So instead of that, we just go g4. And where can the knight go? The knight has 0 squares. The only move is d5. If the knight goes to g7, then knight e4 is game over. There is no way to defend the f6 square and the d6 square. If bishop e7, then e d6, bishop d6, knight f6 check. Let's say king f8. If king f8, bishop h6. Completely busted. Or if king to e7, this is even easier. We just go bishop to d2 and we continue playing. There is no immediate killing blow, but black has 3 awkward minor pieces, a very bad king, and a completely losing position. The engine gives queen b6 as the best move, and after this, just bishop c3. And you can see that there's going to be huge trouble. This is +7. But the worst blunder after e5 is the move knight g4, the pattern we've seen in the previous trap. And now we just go e d6. If pawn takes d6, then we just castle. And again, this is coming, pressure here, bishop h6. Everything is collapsing. If queen takes, then we trade queens, which may seem weird. But now after bishop f4, how does black actually defend? After bishop e6, let's say bishop a6, everything is falling apart. Now the engine says black is okay here. Black's position is fine, black can hold, but the structure is bad and it's not easy to play for black. So remember this, if they go g6 in the Sozin, you take, they take, and you go e5, and the pawn cannot be taken. If knight d7 I showed you, knight h5 I showed you, knight g8 we don't really have to look at, this is very, very poor. We go queen f3, and now either d5 or e6. If d5, we just take with the knight, and this is a double attack. So knight g8 might be the worst move of all. Knight g4 is best, but again, white should have a very, very pleasant position. The next one actually happened in a very famous game, a Fischer-Reshevsky 58, and if you don't know this game, have a look at the game. It ended in about 40 moves, or something like that, 50 moves, because Reshevsky defended well despite being material down, but Fischer ended up winning. Okay, knight f3. Knight c6, d4 takes. And again, this is a sort of dragon position. probably the accelerated dragon would be the best name. Knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, very standard, knight f6, bishop c4. Okay, black castles, white goes bishop b3, and this is a very, very common, very, very famous position. Black has two main moves here, d6 and a5. They've both been played thousands of times. But there's a losing blunder that Reshevsky played here, which after this game, I don't think any good player has played this. It has been played 19 times since the game, and I think the highest rated player was 2500, but I'm not sure what the format was. The reason knight a5 loses is e5. And after e5, what do? You don't really have a choice. If you take on b3, then black is going to end up a piece down after ef6. If you move your knight, I take the bishop. If you take this pawn, then of course a takes b3, and we're a piece ahead. So you take on a1 probably, and now we take on g7, and you cannot save the knight because the knight is trapped. You have to take this pawn. After king g7, we don't even take this knight. We go queen d2. We're going to take the knight later. This is just busted. So after e5, you cannot take on b3. The only sensible move is knight e8. If you go knight h5, then g4 wins the knight. So after knight e8, what does white do? How does white win? Well, again, it's pretty simple. You go bishop takes f7. Now, if black moves the king away, if king to h8, then knight e6. And the queen is attacked, and it has 0 squares. It's trapped. So d6, at least you pick up a knight for the queen. If king f7, then knight e6, of course. And if king e6, we don't have to look at this. Queen d5 check is going to be checkmate. King f5 is the only move. g4 check, king g4, and rook g1. After, I don't know, king h3, there's queen g2. And if king h4, there's bishop g5. It's just all collapsing. Queen d1, queen f3, I don't know. No, not queen f3 because of the rook, but queen d1. Okay, and the main sort of continuation is rook f7. And now again, knight e6, and the queen is trapped. And that's it. Once again, you can see the whole game. It's unbelievable that Samuel Reshevsky basically lost on move 10 against Bobby Fischer. It was just dreadful. The next one is also in a dragon type of position. Go knight f3, d6, d4 takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, g6, dragon, and now f4. f4 is the Levenfish variation, bishop to g7, and in this position e5 is the most common move. I should mention that knight c6 is more common instead of bishop g7 or knight b to d7, simply controlling the e5 square. But if they do continue bishop g7, then we get to play e5. e5 is the same pattern as before. This check in combination with the queen attacking the g4 square. So if d5, then fe5, knight g4 is the losing move. Okay, bishop b5 check, and once again, knight c6, we take twice, win the rook. Queen d7, we take the queen, but we can also take on g4. Or bishop d7, we take on g4. So it's the same pattern as before, but I would like to show you one more thing. If fe5 and knight h5, then it's pretty similar. We go bishop b5 check, they have to go bishop d7. The knight isn't hanging, but knight c6 still hangs the rook, so bishop d7, and now g4, and the knight has 0 squares, and that's it. Queen c7 should be the best move, but I mean, it's just a piece down. Okay, so if they allow e5 in this position, knight h5 is the best move straight away. This is how black should play, without trading the pawns. Because now, after knight h5, when we go bishop b5, if they go bishop d7, and we go g4, they can now actually take on f4. And this is the trick. After knight takes f4, bishop takes f4, this pawn is still on the board, So d5 forks the pieces back. So if they go bishop g7 and you go e5, they should not take the pawns. They should play knight h5 straight away. But if they do, it's game over. This is just over. Knight fd7 is the best move, but white should have a very big advantage after e6. This is almost +1 and very hard to play. Knight e5 should be best, and after ef7 you can see that this is at least more pleasant from a human perspective for white. Black isn't losing straight away, but who would like to play black in this position? The rook trap in the Dragon is one of my favorite traps. I wouldn't say it's too simple or too advanced. It's something in the middle. It's somewhere in the middle. So I think players of all ratings could fall for this. So knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, g6. And now, again, g6 is a strange move here. If they try to enter a dragon-like position before doing normal stuff, we punish them the same way. We go knight c6. And now if d6, queen d8. So most people aren't going to be doing that. It's a fairly pleasant position. After d6, queen d8, king d8, bishop c4, we're on f7. Should be a pleasant advantage for white. And if bc6, again, we go e5. Now, there are several options we have to look at here. Knight h5 and knight g8 are okay. The best move should be knight h5. Knight g8 is +1.5. After something like bishop f4, white just continues developing. If knight h5, white should just, again, continue with bishop c4. Looking at this weakness. But the move I would like to see is knight d5. And many people will play this move. I've seen it before. So it's a pawn sacrifice, basically. For some initiative, for a rook down the b file, a bishop on b7. So black gives up the pawn and goes rook b8. And the idea is, okay, we're gonna go bishop b7. We're gonna have huge initiative, but it simply doesn't work. Now, what can black do here? Let's say black plays bishop g7. Sorry, it's white to play. What can black do instead of rook to b8? Well, if not rook b8, if bishop to g7, we take the rook. Well, what else? Rook b8 is the only move. Okay, so how do we win this position? This is a pretty amazing tactical blow. You can try to find it. This is the only time I'm going to ask you to pause the video and try to find the actual continuation. So the move is e6, and this pawn cannot be taken. The reason it cannot be taken is because there's queen e5, forking the rooks. Now, when have you ever seen a fork of both rooks by a queen on e5? I don't remember any other position that I've seen where this is possible. So let's look at some continuations. If f takes, then queen e5 and black resigns. If I don't know, that's the variation. If d takes, then queen e5 and black resigns. If bishop to g7, saving one of the rooks, then e takes f7, king f8. Again, black should resign. You haven't lost the rook, but there's a pawn on f7. And white's queen is in the middle of black's position. This is completely hopeless. So this is a very, very famous trap, and I think a very good one to remember. So if e5, many people will go knight d5. This is in the spirit of the Sicilian. But it doesn't work. Moving on to the Kann type of position, so positions with e6 and a6. Knight f3, e6, d4 takes, knight takes, a6, the Kann Sicilian, knight c3. Okay, here you go queen c7 or you go b5, and many inexperienced players will play the move g6. I want to show you how to fight this. g6, of course, is not a great move. I mean, it doesn't lose straight away, but after g6, white has a huge advantage. And the engine best continuation against this is h4, h5 with a big advantage to white. Instead of that, there's another way to play. You can go bishop e3. Now, this doesn't give white a +2 advantage like h4, but it prepares to develop in a very interesting way. You're looking at the b6 square and you're threatening knight a4. So this actually sets up a trap. If black continues bishop to g7, it's game over. Knight b3. Oh, sorry, not knight a4. Not knight a4, knight b3. And after knight b3, white's position is tremendous. What does black do? Knight f6 doesn't work because of e5. Let's look at b5. If b5, then we can simply go queen to d6, blockading, and the bishop probably has to go back, or the queen has to go to e7. If queen to d6, if queen e7, we just go back to d2. We've developed the queen for free. And again, where does the knight go? You cannot go to h6, you cannot go to f6 because of e5. You just took the e7 square away from the knight, so this is extremely unpleasant. After knight b3, we are preparing knight a4. This is the main idea that I mentioned, but this is just an awkward move for black to face. How do you continue? If knight c6, then again, we just keep developing bishop e2. What does black do now? Again, knight e7 doesn't work. We go queen d6. And this is a dreadful blockade. So most people are going to go knight e7 straight away. So we could go queen d6, but here's what I would like to show you. We go knight a4. And now how does black defend the b6 square? It's not possible. If black goes d5, giving away b6, we just go knight b6. If rook a7, then e takes d5. E takes d5 and knight takes c8. After, if queen c8, then this is over, bishop takes a7. And if knight c8, then again, bishop takes a7. Nothing works. So after knight b3, black should continue knight c6, and black can still probably hold. We go bishop e2, and they probably should go b5, trying to prevent this idea, but white should have a very pleasant position. g6 is just very, very weakening. So once again, if from this position in the Khan they go g6, you can learn the engine lines with h4, h5, which should give white a great advantage, or you can set up this idea. You go knight b3, you go knight a4, and prepare to play knight b6. And this, I believe, many people will fall for. This has been played many times. People have lost games with black, very high-rated people. The next one in the Khan is a bit simpler. So knight f3, e6, and again d4 takes, a6. This is a move people have played many times, and I should actually give this as a trap for black. I'm sorry. I should have flipped the board. I forgot it for this one. This is a trap for black. But if you turn on the Masters database, there are no games from this position. However, if you turn on the Lichess database, this has been played 30,000 times. Okay? And black has played many different moves, but the best move is e5, forking the two pieces. After this, it's game over. You lose a piece. If you take, then there's queen a5. So please remember this. Do not play bishop f4 as white against the Khan Sicilian. I don't know what the rating was of the 30,000 people who've played bishop f4 here. I'm guessing they weren't very high rated. But if you do play e4 against the Sicilian, just remember that bishop f4 loses a piece. This is, I would say, the most common trap out of all 34 traps you're going to see today. So please remember it if you are not an advanced player. The next one is, this is my favorite one, because this is the one I've been trying to get in a tournament game. And I would say this is probably the most advanced trap. Of course, Reshevsky made one of the blunders, so high-rated players are going to fall for many of these, but this one, I think, is the trickiest of all. So knight c3, we're in the closed Sicilian. Knight c6, bishop b5, this is what I play with white when I play the closed Sicilian. Bishop c4 and e6, the best way for black to play. Knight f3, you can also go knight e2, it's the same thing. knight f6, castles. Okay, in this position, black plays a6. This is the move black has to play, and black wants to expand on the queen side. However, one of the main ideas behind e6 types of Sicilians is to play d5. And in this position, if you're counting, black can play d5, technically, but it loses immediately. I was preparing this for a tournament game 2 years ago. Unfortunately, my opponent didn't fall for it. So with d5, white wins the game straight away. We take, black takes, and we give up our knight. We play knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and now it may seem like black is a piece up, but we can do this. Knight takes d4, c takes d4, and queen h5. Sorry, like black is a piece up, but after queen h5, this is a double attack on the f7 pawn and on the knight on d5, and black has only one way to defend. Against rook e1, bishop takes, queen takes, or the threats on f7, and that's the move bishop e6. And after rook e1, the bishop is pinned to the king, the f-pawn is pinned to the king, so we're threatening rook takes bishop. And the only sensible defense is knight c7, but it's not enough. We just go bishop e6. And again, after knight e6, the f-pawn is pinned, so rook takes, and black resigns. Alternatively, after queen h5, if, I don't know, bishop e7, then we just go bishop takes d5 and black can castle, and now we go c4. If we get this position, this is huge. White is a pawn ahead with an amazing bishop pair and a huge attack. So again, in the close Sicilian, in the main lines, if they play d5 prematurely, you can do this. Takes, takes, knight takes, and you gave up a piece, but you have queen h5, and you're gonna win your piece back with a huge advantage. This one is in the Rauzer, and it's a very uncommon mistake in the Rauzer, but I've seen it played in many similar positions. So knight f3, knight c6, d4 takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, d6, and bishop g5. This is the Richter Rauzer or the Rauzer. Black's best is bishop d7. This is the most common move. White goes bishop e2. And in this position, black's best is queen a5. This is just a standard way to play, attacking the bishop. However, black can play the move I'm about to show you. It's not the best move, but it has been played over 700 times in master games. So it's not a bad move, but you take on a lot of responsibility. Okay. Now, the knight's attack, this is a pretty similar pattern to the Sveshnikov or the Kalashnikov. The knight goes to b5. And after knight d to b5, well, what can black do? Black is in huge trouble. This is already +1.5 for white, and basically black is busted with precise play, with very precise play. What I mean is one engine is going to beat another. Whether a Grandmaster beats another Grandmaster is questionable. White's win rate is 60–70%. Okay, that's huge. Black's best is bishop e6, defending the d pawn, and after bishop e6 there's knight d5, threatening knight c7, so rook to c8, and white is of course better. White castles, let's say a6, bishop f6, and so on. White has a very pleasant position. If instead bishop c8 is played, then the game is over immediately, knight d5. And now there is no way to defend the c7 square. If rook b8, this fails to knight bc7, king d7, bishop g4, and this is going to lead to mate. You don't take the queen, you checkmate. And this, again, is a pattern we've seen in the other traps too, but it's extremely deadly, and it happens in many Sveshnikov, Kalashnikov types of positions. Whenever you get the d5 square, remember this. So if they give it away in the Rauzer, do the same thing. And they are going to have to go bishop e6. I think that's the best move. You have to defend the d pawn, and now after knight d5, this is very hard to play. If they go bishop c8, you win straight away. The next one is a Rossolimo trap, and this one I've actually had with white and I won a game. So knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Rossolimo, and queen to b6. Now queen b6 simply prepares to recapture on c6 with the queen to make sure black doesn't have doubled pawns. White continues normally, knight to c3, and black's best here is pawn to e6. That's just, I feel, the most promising move. If a6, which, I mean, I don't know. A6 is okay, but I think e6 is best. So when they go e6, they're preparing to blast open the center and continue expanding. If white, for example, castles, then knight g7, preparing d5, and so on. But black can also play the move knight d4, and knight d4 in itself isn't the losing move. I'm going to show you what is. This has been played, I would say, about 20 times on master level. So we take that knight, pawn takes, and now the killer move is knight to d5. Now, knight d5 is a very hard move to face and to react to, because if you take the bishop, there's knight c7. Again, another very, very common trick in the Sicilian. So you cannot take the bishop. Now, I'm not saying black is immediately losing, but it's extremely hard to defend. Queen d6 is best according to the engines. But after d3, what's this position? Why does black have a queen on d6? What's going on? Okay, so that's best according to the engines, and it's like +1 for white. Let's look at the losing continuations. Queen a5 loses for a very funny reason. We go queen h5. And again, you cannot take the bishop because of this. So what do? Let's say e6, chasing away the knight. This is completely losing for black. I don't know what to suggest. If, for example, knight f6, then knight f6 and takes and takes, and you lose the queen. So there are no easy moves to make. So let's say e6, which seems more sensible. We give up everything anyway. Bishop takes d7, bishop takes d7, and knight f6 check, and we pick up the queen. So that's why queen a5 loses. What most people would play, the most human move, I believe, is queen d8. And I had this in my game. And I was actually prepared for this. I played queen h5. My opponent played a6. And now queen e5. And that was the end of the game. Here my opponent resigned. You have no way to defend against this. You cannot go d6. There's just nothing you can do. I don't know what to suggest. I mean, here resign, but if, for example, f6, giving the king a square, then knight c7, king f7, and queen d5 check, and I mean, that's it. You can just take on e6, because the d pawn is pinned. The most logical way to play is probably a takes b5, and now knight c7, and black just gives up the queen. I don't know. So this is an incredibly bad move, practically speaking. So you take, and go knight d5. And I guarantee you that you're going to be winning most of your games from this position. And again, it's very common. I've had it in a game, and I don't play the Rossolimo that often. Knight f3, d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6 the Najdorf, and bishop g5, which I'm not sure is the main line still, but it used to be. e6 the main move, f4 the main move, and then this position queen b6 is very common, bishop e7 is very common, knight bd7 is probably the main line these days, considered to be the best. You can play h6, you can play queen c7. But we're going to be looking at the move knight c6, which is slightly odd. Okay, it's a slightly odd move, which I don't think people play these days anymore. I see a game where Dominguez Perez played this in 2010, but it's extremely committal. So the way white punishes this is knight takes, pawn takes, and e5. And of course, h6 has to be played. If you move the knight away, if you play knight to d5 here, you lose the queen, so that simply doesn't work. You have to counterattack the bishop, so h6. The bishop goes to h4, and now we have to continue with g5. Okay, and the bishop drops back to g3. if you want to set up this trap. The best way for white to play, though, is f takes g5. And after knight d5, we are in the main lines. After knight d4, and white should have a very, very pleasant advantage. After g5, though, you can play bishop g3, giving away your advantage. This is very close to equal, but it sets up a very nasty trap. Black should continue knight d5. And after knight d5, cd5, it's about equal. I'm not sure who's better. I would prefer to be white because black's king looks to be in a more dangerous position. However, if they continue attacking your bishop with a seemingly natural gf4, then you win the game. Bishop h4. And that's it. You cannot move the knight. You cannot take the pawn. And the knight is double attacked. If you take, the idea is, of course, queen takes, king takes, and bishop check, picking up everything. And if you play bishop g7, I just take. So that's the end of the game. I think taking and attacking the bishop once more could happen. I mean, the highest rated game where this was played, where black was 24-30. So, you know, not impossible. Another Najdorf trap. Again, we're going to be looking at a very similar position with bishop g5, e6, and f4. In this case, we're looking at what I think is the main line for black these days. Queen f3 is the most popular move for white. You can also go queen e2, but we're going to be looking at bishop c4, which is a very tricky move, preparing a sacrifice on e6. And if you play the Sicilian or against the Sicilian, you'll know that in many positions with a Scheveningen pawn structure, pawns on d6, e6, there are sacrifices. Now, black should play the move b5. That's the best move, inviting the sacrifice. Okay, and white does take. I should say that this is equal. This is 0-0-0-0 if black plays perfectly, but it's so hard to play well. Basically, white isn't risking anything with the sacrifice. You're not worse, but if black goes wrong, black's going to lose. So bishop e6, f e6 forced, knight e6, sorry. Whoa, knight e6. Now, what are the options? You can go queen a5, saving your queen. You can go queen b6, or you can go queen e7. Queen e7 is bad because of knight c7. Queen a5, I think, is the best move. But after knight f8, rook f8, queen d6, it should be about equal. Of course, white did give up a piece, but okay, maybe you don't even have to take on d6. You can, I don't know. You can go queen d4 here, for example. You don't have to take on f8 and take on d6. Sorry, I may sneeze. Okay, so that's the best way for black to play. I really may sneeze. But many people are going to play the move queen b6 because it seems more logical than queen a5. It prevents castling and then threatens queen e3 check. Okay, now against this, we're going to play the move knight d5. Knight d5 attacks the queen, and this has to be taken. It also defends the e3 square, so knight takes, pawn takes. Now in this position, queen e3, sorry, not pawn takes, queen takes, attacking the rook in the corner. In this position, queen e3 does nothing. We can just go king f1 and there are no more checks, and the rook is attacked and knight c7 is threatened. So the fact that the queen is on b6 doesn't really help, or this check doesn't help. Now, how would you defend the rook? Well, most people would play the move bishop b7. Again, similar to what we saw when the queen was on d4 attacking the rook, when they played bishop g7, when the king was on f7. Similar pattern here. If they go bishop to b7, then that's it. Knight c7 check, and you have to take this. I mean, all the squares are covered. Queen takes c7, queen e6 check, and that's it. That's checkmate. I should say that after queen d5, the only good move is actually knight to b8, which, I mean, if they find it, good luck. White should not take the rook now. White should play castles long and just continue developing. If you take the rook, then of course bishop takes e6, and the queen doesn't have any squares for now, so the queen could be trapped, and black should be slightly better, I believe. But if they go bishop b7, which is by far the most natural looking move, then this is incredible. Knight c7, queen c7, queen e6, checkmate. This is the only move, and then mate. The next position is in the Chekover variation. So we're looking at knight f3, d6, d4, c takes, queen takes is the Chekover, and a6, which is the main move. Okay, now bishop e3 is what many people play. This is, I would consider this the main move. Black usually responds with knight c6, and we get this variation, bishop b6. The bishop ends up on b6, and it should be about equal. But if they go b5, it's game over. Queen d5, and the rook has nowhere to go. I've actually had this in my game, and I've only played the Chekover maybe 5 times. Remember this. This is actually very famous and very possible on the lower levels. This has been played 100 times on the lower levels, and believe it, white usually plays knight c3 or a4 or c4. Queen d5 has only been played 14 times. Okay, some people have played queen b6, which is, I mean, that's the move you normally play, but if you can win a rook, you should win a rook. So this can happen. Another one from the Chekover is a very nice checkmating idea. So knight f3, d6, d4 takes, queen takes, a6, again we go with bishop e3, and now again knight c6 is most common, but knight f6 is okay. Knight c3, knight c6, and queen d2. Okay, queen d2 was a tempo, we just want to continue with castles. e6, castles, this is the main stuff we are transposing to mainline Sicilians. In this position, bishop e7 is the most common move, queen c7 is the second most common. And now bishop f4. Now, bishop f4 is okay. h3 is, in my opinion, better, so is knight d4, but bishop f4 is the second most common move. And now black has to play the move knight g4. You have to keep control over the e5 square with both knights. The lines go h3, knight g5, and so on and so on. If black plays knight e5 straight away, then it's over. You are overworked as black. Your queen has to defend checkmates on d8 and the e5 square. And this, again, is an extremely common blunder. So what you do is knight e5, d5, and bishop e5. If queen takes bishop, then queen d8 mate. If people have played this, masters have played this, they've played queen a5 in this position, but white doesn't have to do anything. White just goes bishop e2 and continues developing. The bishop still cannot be taken. If black goes something like bishop e7, then we're going to move the bishop and continue. And we're a clean pawn up with a huge lead in development. This is very, very common. So if they go knight e5, you win on the spot because the bishop cannot be recaptured. The last one for white is in the Nimzowitsch. So knight f3, knight f6, knight c3 is okay. You can also, of course, do other stuff. You can go e5. E5 is the most common move on master level, but knight c3 is the second most common move. And black has a couple of options, but d5, again, is the most common one. E takes d, knight takes d. Bishop to b5, bishop to b7, this is all very, very standard. Of course, if knight takes, then bishop takes. Knight e5. And in this position, black, I think, has one really good move, and that's knight f6, although you can also play bishop takes b5. A very, very common blunder, though, is knight takes c3. And it seems like you're about to lose material. Of course, if in this position you play d takes c3, then bishop takes b5, queen takes d8, king takes d8, knight takes f7, and this is probably the only way to get away with this. Your knight is probably gonna end up being trapped, so you're gonna be slightly worse, but you're surviving. However, you don't do that. You go queen f3. and this is game over. After knight c3, queen f3, there's a threat on f7, so you have to free up a square for your king. If you play f6, which I think many people would do, then queen h5, g6 only move, knight takes g6, and that's it, threatening mate. Again, you have to move the queen, and now just knight takes rook. And if queen c7, making a square for the king straight away, then bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, queen f7, king d8, knight d7, queen d7, and dc3. And you can see that white is up a pawn with a much better pawn structure, with a much safer king, and just in general a winning position. So this, I think, is also pretty standard. I mean, many people would take on c3. Let's actually check the database on Lichess. Knight takes c3 has been played 338 times, and people have played queen f3 264 times in those games. So pretty common. We're gonna begin the traps for black with one simple trap in the wing gambit. White plays b4, and after cb4, a3, d5 is the main line, e takes d5, queen takes d5. In this position, white continues knight f3, and it's a standard game. However, if a takes b4, if they try to win a pawn, then it's game over. Queen e5, you have to defend, and then you pick up the rook in the corner. Believe it or not, I've had this with black. Against a player rated, I don't remember exactly, but my rating was somewhere between 21 and 2200 at the time, online. So I had this happen, unbelievably. Okay, people who play the wing gambit really should know this trick. I think it's a very simple trick. Maybe he was just experimenting. Okay. The Staunton checkmate is very interesting. It's again simple, but they could fall for that. So c4. I mean, I've played this with white. I like this because although you give up the d4 square, it's a decent variation. Knight c6 is the main move. Knight e2 is one of the most common ways to play. White is trying to play a sort of Botvinnik system against the Sicilian. White is trying to transpose to the English opening. So knight f6, knight bc3, and knight to b4. And I've never fallen for this with white, of course, but I've had people play knight b4. Now, what's the idea? Well, the idea is checkmate. But in this position, which I've had 3 or 4 times, you go d4, you just defend the d3 square. In one game, g3 was played, and knight d3 checkmate. So remember this pattern. Knight b4 in itself isn't such a great move. White should be slightly better. But after d4, the position isn't too bad. The knight is relatively useful on b4. It may get chased away, but it's not bad. And you could win some quick games. Next up is the Chameleon Checkmate. Another simple trap for black. But these are the patterns that are very common in the Sicilian, and many players will fall for this. So what's the Chameleon? After knight c3, knight c6, knight g2, e2, g6. This is the close Sicilian Chameleon variation. So g6, d3 is okay, although not too great. d4 is the main move, and after cd4, knight d4, and so on. But d3. Now d3 doesn't lose, it just allows black to equalize easily. Bishop g7, bishop to e3, knight to d4. And now again, in this position, white really should play something like h4 or something provocative like this, and then probably continue knight d5, knight f4 to try and compensate for black's space. One game went g3, and it's the same type of idea as before. Knight f3 is checkmate. So many people who play the Chameleon want to play with g3. That's the reason I'm showing you this trap. If they mess up the move order, and play g3 when your knight is on d4, that's going to be mate. The next one is in the a6 Sicilian, so knight f3, a6, the O'Kelly variation, d4, cd, knight d, knight f6, this is mainline stuff, knight c3. Okay, e5, very, very standard. And in this position, you can go knight f3, you can go knight e2, you can go knight b3. Knight f3, I think, is the best move. It just doesn't allow any trouble. Knight e2 is also safe because it defends the knight on c3. So let's look at knight b3. Knight b3, this is very common to what happens in the Sveshnikov when they, instead of knight here, go knight b3. Of course, here it wasn't possible to go knight b5 because of the pawn on a6, so this is an improved Sveshnikov for black. But in this case, we react the same way we react in the Sveshnikov when they go knight b3, they go bishop b4. And our idea is simply knight takes pawn and end of the game. So most people either play bishop g5 pinning the knight or bishop d3 defending the pawn. So bishop d3. And now we go d5. Again, same idea as in the Sveshnikov to try and punish this move knight b3. Okay, e takes d5. There's a threat to go d4, so e d5. Knight d5 double attack. And now bishop d2 is probably the best move. I mean, what else do you do? Bishop d2. And now knight c3, bc3, bishop d6. And black has a very, very pleasant position with a great pawn structure. We're about to castle, unless they go queen h5. And black long term should be able to win this position. It's not a winning advantage, it's a slight advantage to black, but I believe if you get this against lower rated players, you will be able to outplay them because there's a huge structural disadvantage for white in this position. Now the next one is extremely simple, but I want to mention it because I've actually beaten a friend of mine over the board. He's rated 1300, I would say, FIDE, something like that. Maybe, I don't know, something like that. So we're in the Rossolimo and bishop b5, and black plays a6. Now this is one of the most common lines in the Rossolimo. It's not a great line, but it forces white to give up the bishop pair, and after dc6, there is no queen trade. It's fine. Black just has a6 inserted in the Rossolimo, which helps push b5 and so on and so on. My friend played bishop a4. Now this, I immediately started shouting, this bishop is trapped. That's not what I shouted. I shouted at him different random stuff, but the bishop is trapped. So b5 and of course c4. Please don't fall for this. This is, I would never think of this as a trap if he hadn't done it, but it's actually a trap because now the bishop has to take bishop a4, which is a sort of the standard way to react to a pawn attack on a bishop that's pinning something. To retreat, just loses. Okay, the next one is in the Alapin but for black. So c3, d5, this is what I play with black against the Alapin, and d4, e6. Now I don't play e6, I prefer to develop my bishop and knight first, but okay, e6 is the most common move. Knight f3, knight f6, very, very standard stuff, bishop d3. And there's a losing move for black here that people keep playing. Okay, so black should go bishop e7 or knight c6 or cd4. Those are the standard moves. But people keep playing the move c4. Okay, I don't play the Alapin as white, but I've seen this many times. In the Lichess database, this has been played 1300 times, 1400 times. And most people continue with bishop to c2. The best move for white is bishop e2, and white is winning. Why? Well, it's just a great position with a solid center, and you have to defend the pawn. If you don't defend the pawn, then this is coming. The reason I want to show you this is because c4 actually sets up a trap. It sets up a trap, but if white goes for winning this pawn, because you can play queen a4 immediately, white loses. Why? Because after queen a4 check, there's b5. Attacking the queen, attacking the bishop. And now after queen d1, you just win a free bishop. So c4 sets up a trap. White shouldn't do this, because black is going to play b5. But if you have this position with white, you're actually setting up a trap and inviting black to play c4, losing the game after bishop e2. Because now black has to waste time on b5, white's going to go knight e5. Let's say black goes knight c6, there's already bishop f3 and the game is over. So black will have to move the queen back, waste another tempo, bishop f3 is coming again. I think this is the best move. And then, I don't know. We don't go bishop f3 now because of knight d5, there's a square now, but we can probably just continue a4. And white should be winning. So remember this trap, and please don't play c4 as black, at least not against strong players. Okay, the next one is in the Grand Prix. So we're looking at the close Sicilian with f4, the Grand Prix attack, and black plays g6, which is one of the main moves, knight f3, bishop g7, this is all mainline stuff, bishop b5. Okay, in this position, usually knight d4 is played. This is the best move. This is a very common theme in the close Sicilian. And white usually castles. But you can take on d4. Okay, and after cd4, knight e2. Okay. Now, there are a couple of normal moves here. I think knight h6 should be the best move. Queen b6 is good, knight f6 is good, a6 is good. There are many moves. Okay, but we're looking at e6 now. And e6 is okay, it's not a bad move. White goes d3, okay, and this loses straight away. Now if you play the Grand Prix, you know that your setup is this pawn chain and then you move your bishop and so on. But if you do that while your bishop is still on b5, then there's queen a5 check. I know that this is simple, but I actually won a game like this as black online. And my opponent, this one was over 2200 on leeches. So don't do that. Of course, against e6, white should castle first and then go d3. And in that case, the position is about equal. Now, the f3 mistake in the accelerated dragon is probably the most advanced of all the traps we're going to be looking at today. So knight f3, g6, this is the hyper, but we're going to transpose. Bishop to g7 or cd4, doesn't really matter. Knight c3 takes, knight takes, hyper accelerated dragon. Knight c6, bishop e3, knight f6, this is very, very, very standard stuff. Bishop c4 main move, castles main move. And now white should go bishop b3. And that's probably the only sensible move in this position, if you remember the Fischer game. Against Reshevsky, that's the same pattern. But there's a very common mistake here. White plays f3. And this is a losing mistake. At least you lose a pawn. So on a high level, this is going to be game over. Why? Because of queen b6. This is a double attack. This bishop is going to attack the knight by discovery. And there is no easy way to hold here. If, well, let's look at some options. If, let's say knight takes c6, then there's queen e3. Okay, let's start with the simplest one first. So this doesn't work. If queen to d2, let's say, defending the bishop and preparing that, then we simply have knight e4. And now the knight is attacked 3 times. If f e4, we take on d4. If knight e4, then same thing, we just take on d4. So queen d2 doesn't work. What else? If bishop b3 now, defending the pawn on b2, then again, just knight e4. And that's going to be the end of the game. If knight d5, that still doesn't work, queen a5 check, and after c3, knight f6, we just won a pawn. So, at least you lose the e-pawn, unless you play what was played in one game, knight cb5, which defends everything. It defends the knight and it defends the pawn. But after a6, you have to resign. there's nothing you can do. Where can the knight go? If you go knight a3, then queen takes b2, and your knight has 0 squares. If you go... I actually don't know what else to suggest. In that game, knight f5 was tried, attacking the queen, but after queen d8, the knight is still attacked. So, and this knight is attacked, so knight g7 was played, and ab5 attacks the bishop and knight. So this is the worst that could happen if you blunder with f3, but at least you lose a pawn. So remember to punish an untimely f3 with queen b6. As I said, bishop b3 should be played, and then after d6, you play f3, because there's no attack on b2. But if f3 straight away, this is a double attack on the d4 knight and on the b2 pawn. And the bishop still isn't defended. Okay. The final trap I would like to look at today is in the Khan Sicilian. So we have knight f3, e6, d4 takes, a6, knight c3, queen c7, the Khan Sicilian. This is the knight variation, and bishop e3, which is I wouldn't even call it a slight inaccuracy. It's just a bad move. Why is it a bad move? Well, there's trouble on b4 and on c3. I mean, with bishop b4. So if you're going to move this bishop, I mean, first of all, you shouldn't move that bishop. You should prepare to castle. But if you are going to move the bishop, then d2 is better than e3. Not that it's good, but it's better. So bishop e3. We go bishop b4, threatening to win a pawn. Now, bishop d2 is the best move, losing a full tempo. But most people, of course, are going to go queen d2, not losing a tempo. And now the simple way to play against this is knight f6. Now, what can you do? You can play bishop d3 or f3. Most people are going to go f3. So if f3, then just d5. And again, we're threatening to win this pawn. And there isn't too much defense you could play. If knight d2, then d4 and the knight is pinned, fe4 and just castles, black is winning. If a3 attacks the bishop, then here, takes, and we win a pawn, again losing. Bishop d3 loses straight away to e5 and d4. So there really is no salvation here. And after d5, if the pawn is taken, then we just go knight takes d5, and now it's a triple attack. And it's going to be resigned soon. So remember this. This is a very, very, very common mistake in the Khan. People play bishop e3, and I'm going to tell you how many times this has happened on lichess. This has been played more than 1 million times on lichess. More than 1 million times. And most people here play knight f6. Bishop b4 is better. And black scores, on average, the average is 58% of the time. Okay, so these are the traps I wanted to show you. Again, you can find the PGN, you can find the link to the PGN below. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.